She's a professor of practice for public and private sector partnerships at McGill University's Institute for the Study of International Development, where her research interests focus on innovation and sustainable development for prosperity creation. Éliane teaches and advises in leadership programs to help equip executives in international development with tools that support inner and outer sustainable transformation towards global prosperity. She was a facilitator in the International Health Leadership Development Program, commissioned by the Kenya Red Cross and the International HIV and AIDS Alliance, offered by Lancaster University's Management School. She is a member of Rwanda's National Science and Technology Council. She has led and been a co-investigator on grants funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Grand Challenges Explorations Program. Prior to going back to academia, she was a scientific research and development director in a Montreal-based biotechnology company for 5 years. She is a member of the Presidential Advisory Council for Rwandan President Paul Kagame, a member of the Board of the International Leadership Association, Board of Trustees for the WWF International, and a founding signatory of the Fuji Declaration to ignite the divine spark for a thriving world. Éliane has worked on a number of publications, including most recently contributing a chapter to Leadership and Power in International Development, Navigating the Intersections of Gender, Culture, Context, and Sustainability. This book was edited by Randall Joy Thompson and Julia Storberg-Walker and is the 2018 recipient of this year's R. Wayne Pace Human Resource Development Book of the Year Award. We are extremely excited to have her here with us today. Please welcome Éliane.
So I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you very much, Maya, for the wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody joining us today. So it's very exciting for me to be with all of you. And I just want to start by saying something in my native language in Kinyarwanda. Biranshimishije cyane kuba namwe mwese uyu munsi, kandi rero tuze gufata igihe dufite hamwe tuganire, dusubire mu buzima bwacu, tubone ukuntu ibyo tuza kuganirana bidufashe mu byo dukora. Okay, so it's a pleasure for me to be here with you, and I wanted to start with the webcam just so to give you a sense of who I am, if any of you are using that option. And we're going to start the presentation, and the way I'd like to start it is by reading you a poem. And so just take some time to breathe in and enjoy the space we have together. And I look forward to talking with you, and I'll make this as short as I can to give us as much time to dialogue. Okay, so great. So Maya has already given you my title, and in order to illustrate this title, I'd like to go on and share with you my presentation. Okay, great. And so this is a poem written by Mark Nepo. I've known Mark for a number of years, and he's an amazing poet and a philosopher, and I hope this will resonate with all of you. Okay, just need to move some things around so that my screen is legible for myself. Okay. I've been watching stars rally on the darkness they resist, and fish struggle with and against the current, and hawks glide faster when their wings don't move. Still, I keep retelling what happens till it comes out the way I want. We try so hard to be the main character when it is our point of view that keeps us from the truth. The sun has its story that no curtain can stop. It's true. The only way beyond the self is through it. The only way to listen to what can never be said is to quiet our need to steer the plot. When jarred by life, we might unravel the story we tell ourselves and discover the story we are in, the one that keeps telling us. So I'd just like to start by talking a little bit about myself. So I had some well-made plans. Over 30 years ago, I came to Canada, and my intent was to come and study agriculture and to go back to Rwanda and work with farmers in my country. And a lot of things happened when I arrived. So in 1990, a civil war started in Rwanda. And by the time I finished my undergraduate degree and started my master's degree, I was actually writing my master's degree in 1994, in April 1994, when the genocide against the Tutsis happened in Rwanda, and in 100 days, close to 1 million people were killed. And I remember at the time, there was a Time magazine cover that said, "Hell on Earth," and it was my country. And I thought, who am I if I come from hell on earth? And so what I'd really like to share with all of you is really this idea of a VUCA world is a world where all our well made up plans end up turning into something that we can't really expect, but we still have to deal with. And so for me, it was what happened in Rwanda, but we all have things that happen in our lives that affect us and that take our well-made plans and turn into something unexpected. And that forces us, instead of narrating our own story, to listen to life and to see, what is life narrating through me? And so the VUCA world we're in is really about the increasing rates of complexity. We're communicating here through this medium that is a technological medium that has evolved immensely in the last 31 years since I started university. And it's amazing how we're taking technology for granted today, but the acceleration of the artificial intelligence space is going at such a rate that human consciousness needs to really increase if we want to ensure that the power of the consciousness that we all hold collectively will be able to hold its own in a time where algorithms are taking over a lot of the decision making that's happening in the world. And how is that affecting all of us? There are questions on what will work be in 2050 or in 2100, and for the younger generations today, what kind of work will have? So what does having an environment where we're all so technologically plugged in, how do we connect as humanity? And also, most people today will have 12 different jobs in their life. So if you look 50 years ago, people could have one job from the time they started their work, rise up in that job, and retire in that same job. And so it's also about constant reinvention. And so all of these factors make it more and more difficult to predict what's happening. And it also creates more and more anxiety in our world. And so in the suffering that the people of Rwanda went through with the genocide, what I've realized is that the lesson that I've learned is that suffering is something we all go through in different levels, in different ways, and we all hold anxiety. And what can we each do to manage that anxiety within us, to hold a space of safety collectively so that we all can move forward in a VUCA world in ways where we're able to contribute effectively to humanity and to the planet? And so there's this amazing book that was written in the 50s by Alan Watts, and it's called The Wisdom of Insecurity. And the message, it's a message for an age of anxiety. And what was interesting to me when I read this book is how relevant it is in 2019. And so this is some of what he shares in his book. And I titled this The Price of Consciousness. The human problem. There's a price to be paid for every increase in consciousness. We cannot be more sensitive to pleasure without being more sensitive to pain. But remembering the past, we can plan for the future. But the ability to plan for the future is offset by the ability to dread pain and to fear of the unknown. Furthermore, the growth of an acute sense of the past and future gives us a corresponding dim sense of the present. In other words, we seem to reach a point where the advantages of being conscious are outweighed by its disadvantages, where extreme sensitivity makes us unadaptable. And the challenge in a world where a lot of people feel that they're very sensitive and becoming more and more sensitive is, how do we stay in that space of present? How do we stay in a space where we're not dreading pain, but we're opening to the collective suffering and the inner suffering that we hold? And how do we hold our experiencing self that moment by moment by moment is taking in what is showing up, and also hear that voice of the narrating self that can be saying all sorts of stuff and creating stories on Facebook or Instagram that look lovely but may not really correspond to the lives we're truly living. And so flipping the VUCA world is really to go from this space of volatility, to have a vision for ourselves, to look at the uncertainty that we're facing every day, to what is it we can hold and understand in our own lives? How can we live with a curiosity so that we're able to guide our lives with questions that help us get to know ourselves more and others more? And so the places where we feel tensions, why not look at them with curiosity and say, this is something interesting here. What is it telling me about myself? And what can you tell me more about this? And so how do we look at complexity and the evolving technological change? So Maya said earlier that I work in the biotechnology industry, so I have a PhD in molecular genetics. And in my life, I remember starting out just isolating DNA in my master's degree, to later seeing the first genome being sequenced. And now we're at a time where you can spit in a tube, send it to 23andMe, and you get a whole reading of your genetic profile. And so there's so much information coming at us, and it's only going to get more and more complex. We talk about big data. And how do we hold a place of clarity when we are overwhelmed by the information that comes at us, when we live in a world where we don't know what is truth, what is present, what we're reading? Do we know, does this really make sense? Is it based on facts, or are we reading something that is only a rumor? So holding that place of clarity is really important. And when we live in a place of ambiguity, it's really, how can we be agile through all this? Because what a VUCA world is really about is about constant change. So what level of certainty that we wish to hold on, because as human beings, we yearn for certainty. That space is being pulled out under our feet, and it's important for us to open to this space of change. But how do we do that in ways that don't make us paralyzed by so much going on in the world? And so I talked a little bit about coming from Rwanda, and so these were images of horror for me that really covered that spring and summer of 1994. And it was, am I this horror? Who am I? And what I realized is that reflecting on the suffering that happened in Rwanda, for me, made me realize that if so much energy in 100 days could produce so much suffering and evil, what could collective energy in the world, if we were all focused on collectively working for good, what would that look like? What would be that vision that we could all hold? How would we act upon it? And how would we inspire others to help us make this vision a reality? And so what I realize is that sometimes in the world, we look at things and we're overwhelmed, and we can feel a lot of despair about what we see around us. And this is a saying by Buckminster Fuller that I really find has really helped me through hard times. And it's this idea that we never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And so building a new model really requires visioning anew. And visioning anew is really critical to being able to move forward and have us imagine what the future can be. And that, for me, involves meeting a group of scientists from all over the world, working in North America and all over Africa, and imagining what we could do together. And at the time, I had my PhD was looking at microorganisms and plants, and I met a pharmacologist, an organic chemist. I met researchers working with traditional healers, and we all put our energy together, and we looked at how could we collectively dream up something that could be useful for Africa. And it was really about how do we look at Africa's biodiversity and have it have more power in terms of how leaders were making decisions for the continent. And so we looked at the technology that biotechnology represent, pharmacology, where organic chemistry was, and we looked at how do we take the traditional knowledge that is held in African biodiversity and look at the neglected tropical diseases that affect hundreds of millions, and in some cases, billions of people on the planet, and try and find new medicines against this. And it all started with meeting one person, being introduced to a second person, and collectively dreaming together. And that dream got funded. It wasn't the first funding, but the third funding, and then we were able to eventually get more funding. And what I realized is everything starts with a dream, but a dream requires giving ourselves the freedom to vision what could be if we could have community that holds us and that is able to add their knowledge and values in ways that allow us to dream bigger than we can do on our own. And so one of the things that's really critical in a VUCA world is diverse teams are really important. And it's critical because in this age of technological disruption, where computer science, informatics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing is taking so much space in the world, the reality is most of the people who are working in the spaces do not represent the diversity of humanity. And it's really critical because they are shaping the future of technology, and technology is affecting all of us. We're all meeting today through technology. And how do we ensure that all the voices that are out there are being included in this new medium that is so central to this 21st century? And so the challenge is that large diverse groups produce amazingly better solutions than homogeneous ones, but the creative tensions are greater. And how we hold these tensions is really important. And so contemplative practices are really a great space for us to sit and observe the places of tensions and not judge them, but to really hold them for ourselves and for others so that we become a safe container for creative tensions to be held towards something greater than our collectives. And so I really believe that in the space of turbulence that the VUCA world creates, contemplation is really critical for everybody in allowing us to harness all of what we can bring to the diverse work that we have access to, that is of interest to us, that plays on our strengths and our interests. And as we really move into this ambiguous, volatile, uncertain world, I really would like us to think of these words from Mandela. And he said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." And so the reality today is the level of anxiety that is held collectively and individually is so intense that that space of anxiety can be our individual prison. And in some cases, I talked about the experience of Rwanda. We can also have situations that are either individually or collectively highly traumatizing. And it's important for me, one of the things I realized, it's not to judge what somebody's life is, whether you're in Syria, whether you're in South Sudan, whether you're in Maryland, whether you're in Paris, Berlin, Buenos Aires. It's all about what is happening in that moment, in the present for you, and how do you vision what is possible from a space of freedom. And so I just want to talk about the idea of legacy. So we are the ancestors of people we will never know, people down the line in 100, 200, 300, 400 years. How are we paving the way for them? And part of it is we have no idea how we're doing it, but what we can do is how can we, each of us in our own small way, contribute to diminishing the suffering of this world. And so on this slide, there's a picture of my mom standing next to Coretta Scott King at an event that was held in Atlanta in 1981 that brought African Americans and the African diplomats together to talk about bridging the economic relations between Africa and African Americans. And so one of the things I've realized is that life is always about building bridges to connect what was in the past, what is in the future, and how do we in our present hold that space. And the bottom pictures is me at one of the first workshops I held in Rwanda, and it was me with two colleagues from DR Congo, and it was us talking about, this was around 2008, and in the 90s, so 1994, the genocide against the Tutsis happened in Rwanda, and the flow of refugees in Congo created a lot of havoc in the Congo. And for me to be in 2008 sitting with two Congolese sisters and talking together about how we as African women could be pillars of peace building in the region was something very powerful, because after so much violence, so much terror, it's really important to figure out how can we in our own small ways contribute to building our future. And so imaging a new way forward is really what I see is critical for all of us. And part of it is sometimes we feel that we're at the margins, and there's something very powerful about being at the margins. Being at the margins allows us to see what is happening at the center, but also to see what is happening on the edge. And so it puts us in a place of creative tension and potential innovation that can really help a lot of things change positively. And so part of that for me has been some of the work I've done and writing about Rwandan women's leadership after 1994, and the transformative capacity of just putting one step forward. We never know where we're going. And this idea of feeling such intense suffering and really experiencing so much death and being part of the rebirth of a nation. And so that has been one of the most powerful journeys and communities I've been involved in, and really this idea of bridging traditional wisdom and technological leapfrogging in the way that we are communicating right now. And how do we do that in a way that we vision partner in ways that help us locally wherever we are in the world, and also globally, because we live in such an interconnected world that it's very difficult to stay isolated. A lot of people still feel isolated in their corner, but in my experience, I remember after what happened in Rwanda, and years later, I remember in 9/11, that the weekend after 9/11, I had tickets to go to New York. I was supposed to go to the opera with a friend, and my husband on 9/11 was flying to San Francisco, and his plane hadn't reached the U.S. border yet, and they got back to Montreal, and as he got off the plane and was in the airport, he saw the second tower being hit. And so events like this have made me realize that there is no place in the world where you can live in complete isolation. And this global interconnectedness requires all of us to operate at a higher level of consciousness. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Probably most of you know it. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And so elevating global consciousness is something that is really important to me. And it's really about we all can contribute to this space, because we all can contribute to bringing a smile to someone. And this idea of working towards diminishing the suffering in the world is something we can do in small and then big ways. And if any of you have read any of Yuval Harari's books, the Homo Deus, Homo Sapiens, or the 21 Lessons from the 21st Century, I found his books extremely powerful in terms of looking at where humanity is coming from, where we are today, and where we're going in the future. And so this is a quote that I wanted to share. If we are willing to make efforts to understand foreign cultures, unknown species, and distant planets, it might be worth working just as hard in order to understand our own minds. And we had better understand our minds before the algorithms make our minds up for us. For a few more years or decades, we still have a choice. If we make the effort, we can still investigate who we really are. But if we want to make use of this opportunity, we had better do it now. And so I'd just like to thank all of you for being here. And I really want to keep this as short as possible. And so one of the things I just want to share as well is as we are leading to 2050. So Africa has over 1.2 billion people today, and the projections are we can double that somewhere more between now and 2050. And so how our planet's population will evolve between now and 2050 is really amazing. And that will affect us no matter where we are. It will affect the rates of migration. It will affect nationalism sentiments. It will affect the level of xenophobia. And how we respond to this collectively on a consciousness level is really critical. And at the same time, I really found this quote from the Brookings Institute interesting. In the US, the millennial generation, now 44% minority, is the most diverse adult generation in American history. While its lasting legacy is yet to be determined, this generation is set to serve as a social, economic, and political bridge to chronologically successive and increasingly racially diverse generations. And so the idea of how do we hold diversity in ways that bring our collective intelligence, heart, soul, and mind is really critical. And I love this. There's this beautiful book by Desmond Tutu and Douglas Carlton Abrams, From God's Dream. And it's really about how each of us holds a piece of God's heart, and that if we collectively come together, we actually put that heart together. And for any of you who don't believe, who prefer another term, you can replace God by earth, by the cosmos. But it's this idea that we all have a missing link, and that all of the links are important. And how do we ensure that we can stay hopeful and not succumb to the inner cynic? And by discovering our wholeness and diversity, how do we engage in you? And I also wanted to share this saying by Parker Palmer, where he says, good work is done with heart as well as knowledge and skill, done with a depth of commitment that brings integrity and courage to the workplace. And as we really bring courage, I just want to end with these questions by a friend, Rens, that he shared with me. And it's really about this idea of leading ourselves across boundaries of self and culture. And when we're living in a world with such anxiety, what is our responsibility in terms of showing up with respect, or receiving and giving respect? How do we go beyond blame to a space of personal leadership, where our contemplative practices allow us to hold more and be able to be the safe container for others, to be able to feel their anxiety and not have to act on them, but really rise to a higher level? And how do we suspend that space of judgment and observe what's showing up moment by moment by moment? And how do we listen to each other, even if we're not feeling personally heard? And how do we voice what is in us in ways that whatever pain I'm holding, that what I'm saying, I am not saying through my pain, but I'm saying it through my heart, through my soul? and I'm able to hold the pain I'm holding inside. And so when we're able to move across these boundaries rather than staying frozen or imprisoned, where can that lead us collectively? And so I'd just like to maybe just have Maya come back on, and this is what I wanted to share to make sure that we had enough time to talk.
Thank you so much, Éliane. That was a great slide to end on, and I hope sparks some more questions in attendees. So we'd like to give about a minute or so for folks to start submitting questions. I see some already popping in, so that's great, but we'll give you about a minute and return reading those aloud. So I think a great question to start with, which will probably come up again, is how you can take some of these insights that you've shared with us and implement them into the classroom.
So it'd be helpful so one of the things that I find very, very powerful is in the classroom today, students receive a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, but who they are, who they're bringing up, who they're showing up as does not necessarily have the space. And so what I would love to see is more and more experiential learning where there's space for students to share and for teachers to listen, to get a pulse of where students are at a soul level, at a heart level, and see how that fits with the knowledge that is being brought to them, so that not only are they fed intellectually, but that their souls are invited at the table.
Thank you. So this next question is, well, I'm interpreting it as sort of the next level, which is how to engage, I believe I'm interpreting this correctly, how to engage consultants in public policy in education of the effectiveness of contemplative practices, and if there's a practice that is most effective to do this.
Okay, so I'm going, a lot of things are coming up for me, and this is a very exciting question. So some of it, for me as a scientist, one of the things I'm very excited about is the space where contemplative practice and science are meeting and having us discover the power of contemplative practice in our body. And so Elizabeth Blackburn a number of years ago got her Nobel Prize on the research she did on telomeres, that are the ends of our chromosomes. So our DNA, so we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and that's what holds our DNA. And one of the things that her research revealed is that having a contemplative practice keeps our DNA long, and the more anxiety we have, that the shorter our DNA becomes. And so what's very powerful today, because public policymakers need hard data to show that what we're offering in the space of contemplative practice has effect on society. And so there's more and more research that's looking at the power of contemplative practice in terms of health, and that has a direct effect on healthcare budgets around the world. It has a direct effect on students' capacity for attention, for taking in information, for decreasing the level of violence in the playground, in the classroom, outside the classroom, in society. And so the research that's happening at that interface is very powerful in terms of giving data to public policymakers to really incentivize more funding, more resources, more people to be added to the space of education and contemplative practice, because I really feel, and going back to Yuval Harari's quote, it's really we're running out of time, and we need to elevate global consciousness, and so this is all really critical information in terms of why we need to prioritize contemplative practice and the integration of contemplative practice in education systems.
Thank you so much. A follow-up question to that response was actually just if you could repeat the name of the researcher that you cited.
Oh, Elizabeth Blackburn.
Elizabeth Blackburn. Okay.
Yeah, I will check to make sure that I have her name right.
Okay.
But yeah, she's written, I think she's written several books. So yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. So I believe this next question is asking to outline some of the contemplative kinds of engagement you would suggest for working together and dealing with these challenges.
So could you repeat the types of contemplative engagement?
Yeah, I believe it could be, they could be asking, and if you're still on, you can help clarify, but I believe they're asking for some examples of specific practices that you might suggest.
Okay, so there's so much here. So part of it, if I am an educator, I'm a facilitator, it's what is my capacity to hold collective space? And so having a personal practice, a reflection practice, a contemplative practice is really critical to hold my own anxiety so that I come as close to a clean slate as possible when I'm holding space for others. So that is, I find, is very critical for educators, for facilitators. In terms of collective, the vibration that happens with collective meditation, for yoga practice, all sorts of either just being stillness or movement that calms the mind and takes allows us to connect with body, because we live in a world where everything is in our heads and we confuse our brains and our minds. And one of the things that's very, very powerful is that living in our heads disconnects us from body wisdom, disconnects us from the wisdom of breath that allows us to be present. And so for me, these practices that can go from any type of contemplative practices, from meditation, prayer, poetry, singing, humming, listening to your heartbeat, to just cultivating wonder for the simple things of life, for nature, spending time in nature, spending time thinking about our space of compassion and self-compassion. So meditation around building compassion for self, compassion for humanity. And so for me, the practices are about how do I connect myself in time with the depth of the earth to the immensity of the cosmos. And so it's that interconnectedness of the whole. And so these practices can go through any type of contemplative practice that could be associated with certain types of spirituality, religion, body-based body work that calms the mind and allows us to open to breath. And so all of these. Personally, I do yoga, I meditate every day. I have different yoga practices depending on how I'm feeling. And I've taken part in work related to group unconsciousness to help me hold space for others.
Thank you so much for those examples. So another question, sort of related to one of the previous questions about getting buy-in from colleagues who may feel less optimistic about the role we can play as educators.
Okay, so that's a really, really important question. So I don't know if any of you know of Simon Sinek's work around the big why, the big why of what we're doing. And one of the things Simon Sinek talks about, and he has a great TED Talk that he mentions this, he talks about the innovators, the early adopters, late adopters, and so there's this curve. And this can be anything from technology to social innovation. So in all cases, you have the people who are the innovators, who want to try new contemplative practice, who want to explore new ways of moving forward. And then you have the people who are like, you know, they're not going to be the first, but they will be the first followers. And so there's a whole process. And as the number of people who are involved gets larger and larger, what happens is there's less and less resistance. And so what I find really critical when you're at a space where you have colleagues that are resistant is to seek out the people who are the most open. Because if you work at convincing people, you often spend too much energy having to deal with their fears, with their places of judgment, with the narratives that they hold on and that they do not want to detach from. And what it does is it slows our capacity for partnering for good. And what I've realized is what has worked for me is seeking out people who share the values I hold. And it, for me, I first thought, oh, there's nobody locally. And so it was really reaching out around the world. And then what I realized is when I felt more comfortable in holding that space for myself, then the people locally who had those interests started showing up. And so it's really important to do this organically if we want to maximize the use of our energy, because I think for me, one of the things I really want to minimize is burnout. And so it's really about seeking the partnerships that help us grow our circle of influence and our network of positive change, and to work through that. And so for the people who have more resistance, they need more time observing. They need more time just seeing what happens. They have more fears, and we have to respect where people are so that they're able to come when they're ready, not when we're ready.
Thank you. I have a question here, wondering if you can provide more specifics around the structure of your class when teaching the contemplative practices while at the same time teaching your specialized knowledge.
Okay, so there are different ways I work. One of the ways I work is really stillness. So having space for stillness, and that can be breath work. That can be having people in stillness while I'm drumming just a little bit faster than heartbeat. And then it's also leading through questions. And leading through questions, so sharing as little theory as possible and having people explore individually in small groups and then in large groups what is coming up for them as they look at these questions of curiosity or resistance or whatever shows up. And it's really allowing that space of individual reflection, small group sharing, where people who are more shy may not necessarily want to talk to a large group, and then have a large group where, well, people can encourage each other to contribute to a collective conversation. So that's the formats I use.
Thank you. That's great. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. Maybe I'll give folks a few more moments if anyone has a last minute question. Oh, yep, now they're coming in. So here's another question related to academia. How did you get your class approved at McGill?
Okay. So I just want to deal with two things here. So before I talk about that, one of the things I just want to mention is allowing space often creates a discomfort. And so like today, I chose to talk for only 30 minutes. And so I talked for 30 minutes with the hope that there'll be enough questions to lead us for a full hour. And part of the work I do is creating space for that uncomfortable moment where you don't know if people are going to show up, if what I'm saying resonates. So in terms of approval, what's been fascinating for me is the work I did. I actually, right now, I only teach in executive programs at McGill, and then I teach in executive programs around the world. And the work I've done really started through leadership, because the experience I had in Rwanda really, for me, it was about what is the worst of leadership and what could be the best of leadership. And so my own journey and self-reflection has really gone through understanding and studying mystics and understanding their pathways and what it is to be a light in a space of darkness. And so what I realized is that we all need to find places of light that allow us to move forward. And so it's, what is the language that you need to use for the academic curriculum approval process? What is the language they'll understand to allow what you're offering to be put on the curriculum? The luck I've had so far is that I've given offerings that have been very well appreciated and given me very high ratings. And so I've been invited to do more locally and globally. So I haven't had to struggle with that, but I do think it's really critical to there's a place of translation that is required in terms of how do you translate what you know in contemplative practices into words that somebody who is going to decide whether or not what you're offering is going to be on the curriculum or not. How do you word it in a way that fits what they value, that fits what keeps them up at night, and that fits what they think is critical for students to learn in terms of thriving at the higher institution where you're at. And so it's important to language it in ways that they will get it, because if you don't, then it feels too foreign for them.
Thank you. So one of the last questions, if not the last, is at the country level, and more so in the case of Africa, how would these insights enhance inclusiveness, acceptance, tolerance, and diversity when even democracy seems to be creating more division than unity in the case of the political economy?
Okay, whoa, great question. So that could be a whole course. So one of the initiatives I'm involved in that I'm extremely excited about is something called the Next Einstein Forum. and it's led through the African Institutes of Mathematical Sciences that was started by Neil Turek, whose TED Talk actually won the TED Prize, and so he's initiated these mathematical institutes across Africa. And the idea is to have Africans from different countries come to these different institutes. So there's one in Senegal, in Cameroon, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, and South Africa. And each campus has a minimum of 30% women and has a diversity of people coming from all over Africa. So it's an opportunity of Africans to work together on a scientific level on how to use mathematics to help solve African challenges. So this could be climate change, this could be financial, this could be epidemics like Ebola in terms of monitoring diseases and being able to prevent them to spread. And so one of the things that I find very critical is how can science be a bridge to being in the present in ways that disconnect us from past trauma, past colonization, past imperialism, because the wounds and the suffering and the pain of the past is so deep that I think science can bring about a space that is neutral without judgment, and for building networks and ecosystems of people working together for good. And also in this, there's amazing programs around Africans looking at cosmological research. And so this idea of thinking of Africa not only as what I would like to say, the heart of the planet, but also just thinking about us as humanity as part of the cosmos. And so thinking even bigger than Africa is how are we contributing to innovating for the world and for the universe. And so I think the more we see ourselves as part of something bigger, and so bigger, that means, okay, if it's one country or one village or one tribe or ethnic group, how do we see ourselves as a united Africa? How do we see ourselves as global citizens? How do we see ourselves as beings in the universe working towards exploring the goodness that's in the infinite possibilities that we have to creatively innovate together? And so I think the more we have spaces like that, the more we actually create spaces that allow people to escape from their pain and be in the present and actually live in contemplation.
Wow, thank you. I had to catch my breath for a minute there. That was a wonderful way to end what has been a wonderful presentation. So thank you so much, Éliane, for sharing your work with us and sharing your insights with everyone. I am thrilled to share that we are actually going to be working with Éliane at the 2019 summer session. So if you haven't already read about the summer session, we just opened applications. So this is a great way to get everyone excited about that. And I am very excited to continue working together, Éliane. We also have a retreat for educators coming up next month, March 15th through 17th, Resilience in the Resistance, Contemplative Practices for Recovery and Renewal, being held at the Garrison Institute. To learn more about our events, you can visit www.contemplativemind.org and look under the Events tab. We will be recording this webinar, as I mentioned, and our webinars are made possible by your support. So we invite you to make a donation and check out our extensive webinar archive at contemplativemind.org. You may not be aware of this, but we are just actually 3 full-time employees here at the Center for Contemplative Mind. So all donations make a huge difference. Thank you so much, Éliane, for being with us. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Maya, for creating this space for all of us.
Thank you.